Centuries ago, the chronicles of Aethelgard obscured a profound truth beneath layers of myth and terror. The northern lords offered a fragile, trembling woman as tribute to a monstrous ruler, hoping the beast would devour her and leave their lands in peace. They anticipated a tragedy, a swift execution in the freezing shadow of the Winter Keep. What they did not foresee was that this delicate offering would not merely survive the monstrous Alpha, but forge an empire beside him. The carriage wheels ground harshly against the frozen, unforgiving earth of the Aethelgard Mountains, each jolt sending a shiver through the wooden frame and into the bones of its lone passenger. Beatrice Holloway sat with her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her knuckles white beneath the thin wool of her gloves. Outside the frosted glass, the dense pine forests loomed like silent sentinels, their branches heavy with the first snows of winter. She was traveling deeper into the untamed north, far beyond the civilized borders of her home in Oakhaven, toward a fate that had been sealed by the cowardice of her own flesh and blood. Lord Ramiro Simmons, her uncle and the acting governor of the Southern Territories, had brokered the treaty. The Ironwood Concord, they called it, a desperate pact made to stop the relentless border raids by the lycanthrope clans that ruled the northern wastes. The terms were brutally simple: peace in exchange for a continuous supply of grain, iron, and a single, high-born human offering to the Alpha King. It was widely understood among the southern nobility that this offering was a sacrifice, a piece of meat thrown to a rabid dog to keep it from breaking into the manor. Ramiro, lacking a daughter of his own and eager to dispose of the rightful heir to the Holloway fortune, had eagerly offered Beatrice. She remembered his parting words in the courtyard of Oakhaven, spoken with a sickeningly sweet smile. "Do this for your people, Beatrice. Your sacrifice will be sung of for generations." It was a lie. She would be forgotten, another nameless victim consumed by the beast of Winter Keep. As the carriage finally crested the final ridge, the fortress of Winter Keep came into view. It was a marvel of brutalist medieval architecture, carved directly into the sheer granite face of the mountain. Towering battlements of black stone pierced the overcast sky, and iron braziers burned with roaring fires that cast a demonic flickering orange glow against the snow. There were no colorful banners, no signs of courtly grace, only the harsh, pragmatic reality of a warrior race. The heavy iron portcullis groaned upward as the carriage approached the main gate. Beatrice's escort, 4 terrified Southern guards, refused to enter. They ordered the driver to halt, roughly pulled Beatrice from the cabin, and practically shoved her toward the open moor of the fortress before frantically turning their horses around. They were abandoning her at the threshold. Beatrice stood alone in the howling wind, a dark velvet cloak whipping around her ankles. She refused to tremble. Her father, Sir Thomas Holloway, had been a renowned tactician and scholar before his untimely death. He had taught her that fear was a disease of the mind, cured only by observation and action. Clinging to that memory, she lifted her chin and walked forward into the courtyard. The massive iron-studded oak doors of the inner keep opened, and out stepped a contingent of northern warriors. They were massive men, clad in thick furs and boiled leather, their eyes glowing with an unnatural predatory light in the dimness. At their helm was Captain Alistair Fletcher, a scarred, broad-shouldered man who looked at her, not with hunger, but with a mixture of pity and disdain. "You are the Holloway girl," Fletcher rumbled, his voice like grinding stones. "I am Beatrice Holloway," she corrected, her voice steady despite the freezing air biting at her lungs. "The tribute sent by Lord Simmons," Fletcher snorted. "Tribute. They send a fragile bird to a den of wolves and call it diplomacy. Come, the Alpha King expects you in the Great Hall." She followed Fletcher through the winding, torchlit corridors of Winter Keep. The air inside was thick with the scent of wood smoke, roasting meat, and a distinct sharp musk that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. The fortress was alive with activity, but the moment she stepped into the great hall, a suffocating silence fell over the room. Dozens of lycanthropes, some fully human in appearance, others sporting glowing eyes or elongated canines, turned their gaze upon her, but Beatrice's attention was entirely captivated by the man seated on the carved obsidian throne at the far end of the hall. Gideon Cross, the Alpha King. He was not the mindless, slavering beast the southern rumors had painted him to be. He was impossibly tall, possessing a commanding, lethal grace that radiated raw power. His hair was the color of raven feathers, framing a sharp, aristocratic face marred only by a silver scar cutting across his left cheek. His eyes, however, were what trapped her breath in her throat. They were a piercing, luminescent amber, ancient and assessing. He wore a simple tunic of dark leather and a heavy mantle of white wolf fur, yet he looked more regal than any southern king wrapped in silk and gold. Gideon leaned forward, resting his chin on a massive ringed hand. "So," his voice echoed, a deep, resonant baritone that seemed to vibrate in Beatrice's chest. "Ramiro Simmons attempts to pay his debts with a child." "I am 23, Your Grace," Beatrice replied, keeping her gaze locked with his amber eyes. "Hardly a child, and I am not a payment. I am the fulfillment of a treaty." A low murmur rippled through the hall at her audacity. Gideon's eyes narrowed slightly, a spark of dangerous amusement flaring within them. "A brave little bird," Gideon mused, standing slowly. When he rose, his sheer size was overwhelming. He descended the steps of the dais, stalking toward her with the silent, predatory gait of an apex hunter. He stopped mere inches from her, his towering frame casting her entirely in shadow. The heat radiating off his body was palpable, a stark contrast to the freezing hall. He reached out, one large, calloused finger tracing the line of her jaw. Beatrice forced herself not to flinch. "They sent you here to die, Beatrice Holloway," Gideon said softly, for her ears alone. "They hope my beast will tear you apart, giving them the righteous cause they need to rally the southern armies and break the Concord." "I know," Beatrice whispered back, her heart hammering against her ribs. "But I have no intention of dying to serve my uncle's political ambitions." Gideon dropped his hand, a ghost of a smirk playing on his lips. He turned back to his court. "The tribute is accepted," he announced loudly. "Give her chambers in the western wing. See that she is fed." He looked back at Beatrice over his shoulder. "Survive the winter, little bird. Then we shall see what use you are to me." The western wing of Winter Keep was damp, drafty, and isolated. Beatrice's chambers consisted of a heavy four-poster bed draped in furs, a stone hearth that struggled to keep the creeping frost at bay, and a single narrow window overlooking the sheer drop of the Eithel cliffs. For the first 2 weeks she was essentially a ghost within the fortress. She was provided with food, hearty stews, dark bread, and roasted meats, but she was largely ignored by the pack. It became abundantly clear that Gideon Cross had no intention of eating her, nor did he intend to lock her in a dungeon. He simply expected the harsh environment of the keep, the isolation, and the terrifying nature of his people to break her. He expected her to huddle in her room and weep until the winter claimed her. But Beatrice Holloway was her father's daughter. Sir Thomas had not raised a weeping maiden. He had raised a scholar of history, a student of strategy, and a survivor. Rather than succumbing to despair, Beatrice began to observe. She realized that the doors to her wing were never locked. Taking a calculated risk, she began to venture out into the keep. She learned to walk softly, keeping her eyes downcast, to avoid challenging the volatile lycanthropes, while her mind absorbed everything. She noticed the tension in the fortress. Despite their physical superiority, The pack was suffering. During her explorations, Beatrice discovered the keep's vast, neglected library, a repository of ancient texts, maps, and ledgers left behind by the humans who had occupied the fortress centuries prior. Dusting off the heavy tomes, she began to cross-reference her father's teachings with the reality of the North. It was during these quiet hours in the library that she began to piece together the truth of Gideon's reign. The Alpha King was fighting a war on two fronts. The southern human lords were strangling his supply lines, while a faction of rogue northern packs led by a brutal warlord named Kael was challenging Gideon's supremacy, demanding that the wolves wipe out the humans entirely rather than deal with them. One afternoon, while examining the supply ledgers left carelessly in the library by Gideon's quartermaster, Beatrice noticed a critical flaw. The pack's primary supply of winter wheat and medicinal herbs, specifically wolfsbane root, which the lycanthropes used in microdoses to manage the painful bone-breaking transitions of their shifting, was severely depleted. The southern traders had intentionally stalled the shipments promised in the Ironwood Concord. Worse, Beatrice saw the sickness spreading through the lower ranks of the pack. Without the proper herbs, the younger wolves were losing control of their shifts, becoming feverish and volatile. Gideon was spending day and night patrolling the borders and managing his sick people, exhausting himself to keep his pack from turning on one another. Beatrice realized this was her moment. She could not fight with a sword, and she lacked the claws of a wolf, but she possessed a weapon they desperately lacked: logistical intellect. She gathered the ledgers and a detailed map of the Ethelgard mountain passes she had found and marched directly to the Great Hall. The guards at the door, surprised by her sudden boldness, crossed their spears. "I need to speak with the Alpha," Beatrice demanded, her voice ringing clear in the stone corridor. Captain Fletcher stepped out from the shadows, his brow furrowed. "The king is in council, human. Return to your quarters." If he stays in council without seeing these figures, half his younger warriors will be dead from transition fever before the midwinter solstice. Beatrice shot back, holding up the heavy ledger. "Let me pass, Captain." Fletcher hesitated, sensing the gravity in her tone, before nodding curtly. He pushed open the heavy oak doors. Gideon stood over a massive wooden table in the center of the hall, surrounded by his lieutenants. He looked exhausted, the shadows under his amber eyes bruised and dark. When Beatrice entered, the room fell silent, the air instantly thick with hostility from the surrounding wolves. "What is the meaning of this?" Gideon growled, his voice vibrating with a dangerous edge. "I did not summon you, Beatrice." "You did not, Your Grace," Beatrice said, walking straight to the table. She ignored the growls of the lieutenants and slammed the ledger down on top of their war map. "But you are blind to the knife at your own throat." One of the lieutenants, a massive scarred wolf named Torin, snarled and stepped toward her. "You dare?" "Stand down, Torin," Gideon commanded softly, though the authority in his voice made the massive warrior instantly freeze. Gideon turned his piercing gaze to Beatrice. "Explain yourself." "Quickly. My uncle, Lord Simmons, is not merely delaying the supplies out of spite," Beatrice stated, opening the ledger and pointing to the columns of numbers. "He is employing a classic siege tactic of attrition. He knows about the transition fever. My father wrote of it in his treatises on northern biology. By withholding the wolfsbane root and the grain, Simmons is forcing your pack to consume your winter reserves 3 months early." She unrolled her own map, placing it over Gideon's. "You have your patrols stationed here at the Red Valley, expecting an attack from the rogue packs. But Simmons has quietly moved an embargo line here, along the Whispering Pass. He is choking you to death without drawing a single sword. When your pack is weak and crazed from the fever, the rogues will attack, and Simmons will sweep in to claim the glory of destroying the survivors." The silence in the hall was deafening. The lieutenant stared at the maps, the realization slowly dawning on their faces. Gideon looked from the map to Beatrice, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, the only sound was the crackling of the hearth. "How do you know this?" Gideon finally asked, his voice a low rumble. "Because Sir Thomas Holloway was my father," Beatrice said proudly. "And because I refused to die as a pawn in Ramiro Simmons' game. I offer you a solution, Alpha, but you must trust me." Gideon stared into her eyes, searching for deceit. Finding none, a slow, genuine smile spread across his face, transforming his terrifying visage into something strikingly handsome. "Speak, little bird," Gideon said, leaning over the table. "Show me how to break the cage." Beatrice's intervention in the council room fundamentally shifted her position within Winter Keep. She was no longer the sacrificial lamb shivering in the western wing. She had become an anomaly, a human woman who possessed the strategic mind of a veteran commander. With Gideon's cautious approval, Beatrice took over the rationing of the fortress. She calculated precise caloric intake requirements to stretch the grain, and more importantly, she scoured the old human botanical texts in the library. She discovered that a native moss growing in the high-altitude caves of the keep, which the wolves had long ignored, contained trace elements of the same compounds found in wolfsbane. It wasn't a perfect substitute, but when brewed into a bitter tea, it acted as a strong palliative, soothing the younger wolves and halting the spread of the transition fever. As the fever subsided, the mood in the fortress lightened. The pack began to look at Beatrice not with hostility, but with a grudging, bewildered respect. Even Captain Fletcher offered her a slight bow when she passed him in the corridors. Her closest proximity, however, was with Gideon. The Alpha King began summoning her to his private solar in the evenings. The room was warmer than the rest of the keep, lined with furs and lit by a massive, roaring fire. Ostensibly, they met to discuss strategy, mapping out supply routes to bypass Simmons' embargo by trading with the neutral fishing villages on the western coast. But as the deep winter nights stretched on, their conversations drifted away from war. One evening, Beatrice sat by the fire, her fingers stained with ink from redrawing territorial maps. Gideon was seated across from her in a heavy leather chair, watching her with that intense amber gaze. He had shed his heavy furs, wearing only a linen shirt that stretched tight across the heavy musculature of his chest and arms. "You possess a formidable mind, Beatrice," Gideon said quietly, breaking the silence. "Your father would be proud." Beatrice paused, her quill hovering over the parchment. A pang of grief tightened her chest. "My father was a brilliant man, but he trusted the wrong people. He believed in honor. My uncle Ramiro used that honor to steal his estate and send me here." Gideon leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "The wolves are often called monsters by your kind because of our nature. Because we shift, because we hunt. But the true monsters I have faced in my long life have always worn the faces of civilized men in silk doublets." He reached out, his massive hand gently covering hers, stilling her trembling fingers. The warmth of his touch sent a sudden, startling jolt of electricity up her arm. "You are not a sacrifice here, Beatrice. Not anymore. You have become the shield this pack did not know it needed." Beatrice looked up into his eyes, the breath catching in her throat. The terrifying Alpha King was looking at her, with a vulnerability that stripped away all his armor. In that moment, the line between captor and captive vanished, replaced by a raw magnetic pull that neither of them could ignore. Before either could speak, the heavy doors to the solar burst open. Captain Fletcher stood in the doorway, chest heaving, his sword already drawn and dripping with dark blood. "Alpha, treachery. The western gate has been breached." Gideon was on his feet in an instant, the tender moment shattering as the beast within him rose to the surface. His eyes flared a brilliant, terrifying gold, and a low, guttural snarl vibrated from his chest. "Simmons." "No," Fletcher spat. "It's Cale." The rogues have bypassed the valley. They had inside help. Someone opened the postern gate. They are in the lower bailey, slaughtering the sick. Ash! But Gideon cursed, grabbing his massive broadsword from the mantle. He turned to Beatrice, his expression fierce and commanding. Stay here. Bar the door. Do not let anyone in, unless it is me or Fletcher. Gideon, wait! Beatrice cried out, but he was already gone, sprinting down the corridor with unnatural speed, Fletcher hot on his heels. Left alone, Beatrice rushed to the heavy oak door, throwing the iron bolts into place. Her heart hammered against her ribs as the sounds of slaughter echoed up from the lower levels of the keep, the clash of steel, the horrific tearing of flesh, and the bone-chilling howls of wolves locked in mortal combat. She paced the solar, her strategic mind racing. Cale had inside help. The postern gate was highly restricted. Who had the keys? The quartermaster, the single father named, had left the ledgers out, would fail to report the missing wolfsbane until it was too late. It wasn't incompetence, it was sabotage. The quartermaster was working for Cale. If the quartermaster had opened the postern gate, he would also know that Gideon would rush straight to the lower bailey to defend the sick. It was a diversion. The real target wasn't the sick wolves, it was the Alpha himself. Beatrice rushed to the window overlooking the inner courtyard. Down below, illuminated by the chaotic light of burning braziers, she saw the battle. Gideon was a force of nature, cutting through the rogue wolves with devastating power, his broadsword a blur of silver. But Beatrice's eyes scanned the shadows of the battlements above him. There, creeping along the stone walkway directly above Gideon, were 3 rogue assassins, armed not with swords, but with heavy silver-tipped crossbows, the one weapon guaranteed to inflict fatal, unhealing wounds on a lycanthrope. They were aiming right at Gideon's exposed back. Beatrice didn't think. She acted. She ran to the mantel, grabbing the heavy hunting horn Gideon kept displayed there. She threw open the bolted door, ignoring Gideon's orders, and sprinted down the winding stone stairs, taking them 2 at a time. She burst out onto the second-level balcony overlooking the courtyard, just as the assassins raised their weapons. Drawing a deep breath into her lungs, Beatrice raised the horn to her lips and blew with every ounce of strength she possessed. A deafening, booming blast shattered the air above the courtyard, echoing off the granite walls of the mountain. The sudden piercing sound startled the assassins. Their fingers jerked on the triggers. 2 bolts flew wide, shattering against the cobblestones, while the 3rd grazed Gideon's pauldron, tearing through the leather but missing his flesh. Gideon spun around, his golden eyes snapping up to the balcony. He saw the assassins, and in the same heartbeat, he saw Beatrice standing there, the horn in her hand. With a roar that shook the very foundations of Winter Keep, Gideon leapt, using the stone debris to launch himself up to the battlements. In seconds he tore through the assassins, eliminating the threat with brutal efficiency. The battle below quickly turned. With the element of surprise lost and their alpha enraged, Gideon's pack rallied, driving Cale's forces back through the breached gate and out into the freezing night. When the courtyard finally fell quiet, save for the groans of the wounded, Gideon stood on the battlements, his chest heaving, his sword dripping. He looked down at Beatrice, who was still clutching the horn, her knees trembling from the adrenaline. He climbed down from the wall and walked toward her. His warriors, battered and bloody, watched in silence. Gideon stopped before her, his massive frame radiating heat and power. He reached out, taking the horn from her shaking hands and tossing it aside. Then, in front of his entire war-torn court, the terrifying Alpha King of the North dropped to one knee before the human woman they had once called a sacrifice. He bowed his head, taking her small hand in his, and pressing his forehead against her knuckles. "You saved my life, Beatrice Holloway," Gideon said, his voice echoing in the quiet courtyard, a solemn vow binding them together. From this night until the end of my days, you are under my protection, not as a ward, not as a tribute, but as the heart of Winter Keep. Beatrice looked down at the fierce warrior kneeling before her, realizing that the political game her uncle had played had just backfired spectacularly. She had not been devoured by the beast. She had tamed him. But as the winds howled through the Eiffelgard Mountains, carrying the scent of blood and impending war, Beatrice knew their fight had only just begun. Lord Simmons and the southern armies would soon realize the Ironwood conquered was broken, and Cow's rogues would regroup. The storm was coming, but for the first time in her life, Beatrice was ready to face it. Morning broke over Winter Keep, painting the snow-capped peaks in shades of pale rose and bruised purple. The courtyard, recently a battlefield of chaotic shadows, was now a hive of grim recovery. Pyres were built for the fallen, their smoke spiraling into the crisp, unforgiving sky. Inside the great hall, the atmosphere was a volatile mixture of triumph and simmering rage. The pack had survived, but the revelation of treason within their own walls left a bitter taste in every mouth. Oswald the quartermaster knelt on the cold stone floor, his wrists bound in heavy iron chains. He was a balding, portly human who had served Winter Keep for a decade, making his betrayal all the more cutting. Gideon paced before him, the Alpha's presence so suffocatingly intense that the surrounding guards subconsciously took a step back. Beatrice stood near the hearth, wrapped in a thick sable cloak Gideon had draped over her shoulders the night before. She watched the interrogation with clinical precision. "You opened the postern gate," Gideon stated, his voice devoid of a roar, replaced instead by a chilling, quiet menace. "You let Cale's butchers into the lower bailey. Why?" Oswald trembled, his eyes darting frantically. "I had no choice, Your Grace. They threatened my family in the lower villages. They said if I did not let them in, my daughters would burn." Gideon paused, his golden eyes narrowing. For a moment a flicker of understanding crossed his scarred face. But Beatrice stepped forward, her sharp mind catching the inconsistency. "That is a lie, Oswald," Beatrice said evenly, her voice cutting through the heavy silence. "Kyle's rogues despise humans. They do not take hostages in the lower villages. They leave no survivors. Furthermore, the missing Wolfsbane route and the delayed grain shipments began nearly 2 months ago. Kyle only allied his forces 3 weeks past." She stepped closer to the trembling man. "You were not blackmailed by northern rogues. You were bought by southern gold." Oswald's face drained of color. He looked from Beatrice to the towering Alpha, realizing his deception had been entirely dismantled by the young woman. "Tell the truth," Gideon growled, stepping into Oswald's space, "or I will let Captain Fletcher extract it from you piece by piece." Sobbing, Oswald collapsed forward. "It was Lord Simmons. He sent a courier weeks ago. He promised me an estate in Oakhaven if I crippled your supplies and paved the way for Cal to take the Alpha throne. Simmons wants the mountains for the iron mines, and Cale wants the pack. They have a pact." A collective snarl ripped through the gathered lycanthropes. An alliance between a human governor and a rogue lycanthrope warlord was unprecedented. It was a union born of pure greed and mutual malice. Before Gideon could issue a sentence, the heavy doors of the hall creaked open. A young scout rushed in, dropping to one knee. "Ulfa." A southern delegation approaches the main gate. They carry the banner of Oakhaven. They claim they bring delayed provisions and a diplomat to check on the welfare of the tribute. Beatrice's breath hitched. Ramiro Simmons was moving his pieces faster than she had anticipated. "Who leads the delegation?" she asked the scout. "A man who calls himself Lord Cedric Winslow, my lady." Ice flooded Beatrice's veins. Cedric Winslow. He was a minor lord from a neighboring estate in the south, and more importantly, he was her former betrothed. When Sir Thomas Holloway had died, and Ramiro Simmons had usurped the family wealth, Cedric had broken the engagement within a fortnight, abandoning Beatrice to her uncle's cruel whims. To send him here was a calculated psychological strike by Simmons. "Let him in," Gideon commanded, though his eyes never left Beatrice's face, reading the sudden tension in her posture. He gestured for the guards to drag Oswald to the dungeons. "We will welcome our southern guest with all the hospitality he deserves." An hour later, Cedric Winslow strode into the great hall, cloaked in fine southern velvet and sporting an arrogant, practiced smile. He stopped before the dais, offering a shallow, insulting bow to Gideon. Then his gaze slid to Beatrice, widening in genuine shock. He had clearly expected to find a broken, traumatized captive, not a regal woman standing proudly at the right hand of the Alpha King. "Beatrice," Cedric purred, recovering his composure. "You look remarkably well. Lord Simmons sends his warmest regards. He was deeply concerned when the winter storms delayed our supply wagons. We have brought the missing grain and a peace offering." He gestured to his squires, who brought forward a beautifully carved wooden chest. Inside rested a single, ornate crystal decanter filled with a deep, ruby-red liquid, a vintage wine from the personal cellars of Oakhaven, to celebrate the continued endurance of the Ironwood Concord. Gideon looked at the wine, then at Cedric. "A generous gift." "We ask only that we share a toast," Cedric insisted, his smile tightening. "To peace." Beatrice watched Cedric's hands. She knew this man. She knew his cowardice, his ambition, and his tells. Whenever Cedric lied, the thumb of his left hand subtly stroked the side of his index finger. He was doing it now. "A toast sounds wonderful, Lord Winslow," Beatrice interrupted smoothly, stepping down from the dais. She picked up 2 silver goblets from a side table and handed one to Cedric, then placed the other in front of Gideon. "Allow me to pour." She took the crystal decanter. As she uncorked it, the rich scent of fermented grapes filled the air, masking a very faint, bitter undertone. Wolfsbane, processed, concentrated, and lethal. To a human, it was a mild stomach irritant. To a lycanthrope, a concentrated dose delivered straight to the bloodstream via alcohol was an agonizing death sentence. Beatrice poured a generous measure into Gideon's goblet, then filled Cedric's. Finally, she poured a small amount into a third goblet for herself. "To peace, Cedric," Beatrice said, raising her glass. Gideon reached for his goblet, but Beatrice subtly shifted her weight, kicking Gideon's boot beneath the table. The Alpha paused, his sharp eyes catching the micro-expression on her face. "Actually," Beatrice said cheerfully, turning to Cedric, "it is northern custom that the guest of honor drinks from the Alpha's cup to prove the purity of the bond." Without waiting for a response, she swapped Cedric's goblet with the one intended for Gideon, the one she had poured slightly more into from the bottom of the decanter, where the heavier poison would settle. Cedric's arrogant smile vanished. He stared at the goblet in his hand as if it were a coiled serpent. Sweat beaded on his forehead. I could not presume to drink from the king's cup. It is highly improper." "Nonsense," Gideon rumbled, catching on instantly. He leaned forward, his amber eyes locking onto the trembling southern lord. "Drink, Winslow, or do you find our northern hospitality lacking?" Cedric's hand shook violently. He looked at the guards, at the massive lycanthrope surrounding him, and finally at Beatrice, whose eyes were cold and uncompromising. "No," Cedric choked out, dropping the goblet. The silver clattered against the stone, the red wine spilling like blood across the floor. "No, I will not. Captain Fletcher," Gideon said, his voice dropping to a terrifying register. "Secure the guest. It seems Lord Simmons' vintage is spoiled. As the guards seized a screaming Cedric, Beatrice looked down at the spilled wine, the bitter scent of wolfsbane now undeniable as it oxidized on the stone. Simmons had tried to murder the Alpha in his own hall. The Cold War was over. Candlelight flickered violently against the stone walls of the Alpha's private solar, dancing to the rhythm of the howling wind outside. A heavy map of the Ethelgard region dominated the central table, weighed down by daggers and inkwells. Gideon stood by the hearth, the firelight catching the silver scar on his cheek. He watched Beatrice as she moved pieces across the map, her brow furrowed in deep concentration. The incident with Cedric Winslow had shifted the atmosphere in the keep entirely. The pack was preparing for war, sharpening steel and repairing armor, but here in the quiet of the solar, a different kind of tension hung thick in the air. Winslow confessed to everything in the dungeons, Gideon said quietly. Simmons plans to march a battalion of southern mercenaries through the Whispering Pass in 2 weeks. Kale's rogues will meet them on the other side, squeezing Winter Keep in a vice. Beatrice didn't look up, her finger tracing the narrow gorge of the Whispering Pass on the parchment. It is a bold strategy. Simmons is using the winter to mask his troop movements. But he has made a fatal miscalculation. And what is that, little bird? Gideon asked, stepping closer to the table. He believes I am dead, or at least irrelevant, Beatrice replied, finally lifting her gaze to meet his. And he believes you are a mindless beast who will charge headlong into a frontal assault. He does not know we have intercepted his communications. He does not know we hold his envoy. We control the board, Gideon. Gideon closed the distance between them. The sheer size and heat of him was intoxicating. He reached out, his knuckles gently brushing a stray lock of dark hair behind her ear. You speak of war with the mind of a general, Beatrice. But you are still human. When the clash comes, Simmons will target you above all others for your defiance. Beatrice leaned slightly into his touch, her heart accelerating. I am not afraid of Ramiro Simmons. I am only afraid of losing this. She gestured around the room, but her eyes remained locked on his. This home, this pack. A low, possessive rumble vibrated deep in Gideon's chest. The beast within him, usually kept under ironclad control, pushed against the surface, answering the fierce loyalty in her voice. He kept her face in both of his massive hands, his thumbs tracing her cheekbones. You will not lose it, Gideon vowed, his voice thick with emotion. I claimed you as the heart of Winter Keep, but you are more than that to me, Beatrice. You are my equal, my mate. The word hung in the air, heavy and absolute. In lycanthrope culture, a mate was not merely a spouse, it was a soul-binding connection, an irreversible merging of lives. Beatrice felt a tear slick down her cheek, not of sorrow, but of an overwhelming, profound relief. She had spent her life being treated as a pawn, an afterthought, a burden. Here, in the arms of a terrifying northern king, she was wholly seen and completely cherished. Rising onto her toes, Beatrice closed the final inch between them and pressed her lips to his. Gideon groaned, a sound of desperate surrender, and wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her flush against his solid frame. The kiss was consuming, a tempest of heat and raw, unspoken promises, sealing the bond between the human strategist and the Wolf King. When they finally parted, both breathless, Beatrice rested her forehead against his chest, listening to the rapid, powerful drumming of his heart. We need an army, she whispered against his linen shirt. Your pack is lethal, but Kale and Simmons outnumber us 3-1. The neighboring packs will not join us in time, Gideon admitted, his chin resting on the top of her head. Kale has blocked the northern roads. Beatrice stepped back, a dangerous, brilliant light sparking in her eyes. Then we will not look north. We will look south. She turned back to the map. When my father was alive, he commanded the loyalty of the Silver Vanguard, a highly trained regiment of human knights stationed in the borderlands. They despised Ramiro Simmons, but when my father died and Simmons seized power, they were exiled to the outer garrisons. They are still there, rusting away, waiting for a true commander. You want to recruit human knights to fight alongside lycanthropes? Gideon asked, his eyebrows raising in surprise. It has not been done in 3 centuries. Then it is time to make history, Beatrice stated firmly. We will draft a letter in my name, bearing my father's personal seal. I managed to smuggle his signet ring with me. We will offer the Vanguard the one thing Simmons took from them, their honor and a chance for vengeance. Gideon stared at her, awe mingling with deep affection. And how do we get this letter past Simmons' embargo? We don't, Beatrice smiled, a cunning, predatory expression that made her look every bit the Alpha's mate. We let Cedric Winslow escape. The plan was audacious. That night, Captain Fletcher arranged for the guards on the dungeon level to be conspicuously absent. A heavily locked door was left slightly ajar, the keys conveniently hanging on a nearby peg. Cedric, desperate and terrified, took the bait. He slipped out of his cell, stole a horse from the lower stables, and fled into the freezing night, riding desperately for the southern border. What Cedric did not know was that sewn into the lining of his stolen saddlebags was Beatrice's sealed letter, alongside a set of falsified orders detailing a fake patrol route for Gideon's forces. Beatrice had calculated the logistics flawlessly. Cedric, being a coward, would not ride directly to Simmons. He would seek shelter at the first human garrison he encountered to demand an escort. That garrison was the fortress of the Silver Vanguard. They would search him, find the letters, and see Beatrice's seal. Now, Beatrice said softly, standing with Gideon on the high battlements, watching the distant, fading speck of Cedric's horse disappearing into the snow. The trap is set. Simmons will march his men into the Whispering Pass, expecting to ambush a small, vulnerable wolf patrol. Gideon wrapped his heavy fur mantle around her shoulders, pulling her against his side to shield her from the biting wind. He looked out over the dark expanse of his kingdom. And instead, the Alpha King finished, a feral, anticipatory grin spreading across his face. He will find the full might of Winter Keep, and a wall of silver steel waiting for him. Opening hook for video centuries ago, an arrogant southern lord sent his niece into the frozen mountains as a human sacrifice to a terrifying werewolf king. It was supposed to be a brutal execution to fuel a political war. But the lord made one fatal miscalculation. He didn't just send a helpless maiden to the slaughter. He delivered a brilliant tactician directly into the arms of the ultimate apex predator. This is the untold history of how a doomed tribute forged an unstoppable empire. Jagged cliffs of black shale rose on either side of the Whispering Pass, creating a natural wind tunnel that shrieked with the voices of the mountain. Lord Ramiro Simmons sat comfortably atop his armored warhorse, wrapped in layers of heavy bear fur. Behind him marched 300 southern mercenaries, their boots crunching in unison against the packed snow. To his right flank moved Kyle and his rogue lycanthropes, massive, feral beasts, who looked upon the human soldiers with undisguised hunger. Simmons smirked, his breath pluming in the freezing air. The plan was moving perfectly. Cedric Winslow had returned to Oakhaven half-frozen and blubbering about his escape, bearing stolen intelligence that confirmed Gideon's pack was weak, diseased, and moving a small patrol through this very gorge. "Keep your beasts in line, Kale," Simmons sneered, looking down at the scarred rogue leader looped alongside the horses in his half-shifted form. "Once we slaughter Gideon's patrol and take the keep, you shall have your throne. But until the ironwood mines are secured, you obey my commands." Kale's yellow eyes flashed with venomous hatred, a low growl vibrating in his throat. The alliance was a powder keg, entirely reliant on mutual greed. As the vanguard of Simmons' army reached the narrowest choke point of the gorge, a sudden, unnatural silence fell over the pass. The wind stopped howling. High above, standing on a perilous overhang of rock, Beatrice Holloway looked down at the invading army. She wore fitted, boiled leather armor crafted specifically for her by the keep's armorer, her dark hair braided tightly against her scalp. Beside her stood Commander Tristan Godfrey, the hardened, grizzled veteran of the Silver Vanguard. When Cedric Winslow had fled south, he had indeed run straight into Commander Godfrey's border garrison. Upon discovering Beatrice's sealed letter and the stolen signet ring of Sir Thomas Holloway, Godfrey had recognized the truth. He remembered the brilliant, honorable Sir Thomas, and he despised Simmons for leaving his knights to rot in the outer provinces. The vanguard had not merely answered Beatrice's call, they had marched with a righteous fury. "Your uncle looks quite confident, Lady Beatrice," Commander Godfrey murmured, his hand resting on the hilt of his broadsword. "Arrogance is a heavy armor, Commander," Beatrice replied coldly. "It protects the ego, but it blinds the eyes. Sound the charge." Godfrey raised a shining silver horn to his lips and blew a clear, piercing note that shattered the silence of the gorge. Down in the pass, Simmons yanked on his horse's reins, his head snapping upward. Before he could issue an order, the snowbanks on the steep inclines ahead of them erupted. Gideon Cross and his elite warriors did not merely step out of hiding, they exploded from the earth like forces of nature. They were not diseased or weakened. They were at the peak of their lethal strength, fueled by the wolfsbane substitute tea and a burning desire to protect their home. Gideon, fully shifted into a towering, nightmarish beast of pure black fur and golden eyes, let out a roar that shook the shale from the cliffs. He crashed into the front lines of the mercenaries, a whirlwind of claws and teeth that threw armored men through the air as if they were made of straw. "Ambush!" Simmons screamed, drawing his sword. "Kale! Attack them!" But the true twist of the valley was yet to unfold. From the rear of the pass, the thunder of heavy hooves echoed off the stone. The Silver Vanguard 200 elite human knights, clad in shining steel, charged into the gorge, sealing the trap. Simmons stared in sheer horror as the silver banners of the vanguard snapped in the wind. "Godfrey, you traitorous dog. You side with monsters. I side with the rightful heir of Oakhaven." Godfrey bellowed, swinging his massive blade and cutting a swath through Simmons's corrupt mercenaries. Caught between the ferocious might of the Alpha's pack and the disciplined steel of the Silver Vanguard, the Southern Army descended into absolute panic. Kale, realizing the patrol route was a brilliantly orchestrated lie, turned his furious gaze upon Simmons. "You led us into a slaughter," Kale roared, lunging at Simmons' horse. The rogue's jaws snapped shut on the horse's neck, sending Simmons tumbling into the bloody snow. Simmons scrambled backward, his velvet cloak soaked in freezing mud. He was cornered, his own mercenary army breaking ranks and fleeing into the unforgiving steel of the vanguard. But Ramiro Simmons was a rat who fought dirtiest when cornered. "Ignite the wagons!" Simmons screamed to a loyal contingent of engineers hiding near the rear. "Burn them all." Beatrice, watching from the cliffs, narrowed her eyes. She saw the engineers pulling heavy canvas tarps off the supply wagons they had dragged into the pass. Beneath the tarps were not barrels of grain, but iron vats of alchemical silver fire, a volatile, highly illegal explosive concocted by rogue alchemists. Simmons didn't just want to win, he was willing to obliterate the entire valley, killing wolves, vanguard knights, and his own men just to ensure Gideon and Kale died in the blast. "Tristan," Beatrice shouted, pointing frantically. "The wagons, if those vats catch a spark, the blast will collapse the gorge and bury everyone." Godfrey cursed, but he was engaged with 3 mercenaries and could not break the line. Gideon was 100 yards away, locked in a brutal, flesh-tearing duel with Cale. Beatrice realized she was the only one with a clear vantage point. She grabbed a heavy crossbow from a fallen sentry beside her, loaded a steel-tipped bolt, and planted her boots firmly near the edge of the cliff. She was no warrior, but her father had taught her the mathematics of ballistics and the weak points of alchemical pressure valves. She took a deep breath, slowing her racing heart. Below her, a mercenary engineer struck a flint, raising a burning torch toward the fuse of the main vat. Beatrice exhaled and pulled the trigger. The bolt sliced through the freezing air, humming a deadly tune. It struck the mercenary dead in the shoulder. He screamed, dropping the torch into the snow just inches from the fuse. Before another engineer could grab the flame, Commander Godfrey broke through the lines, his broadsword severing the iron release valves of the vats, spilling the volatile liquid harmlessly into the frozen earth before it could be ignited. The catastrophic threat was neutralized by the precise intellect of a human woman and the bravery of a seasoned knight. The battle in the pass culminated in a circle of blood-stained snow. The mercenaries had thrown down their weapons, surrendering to the Silver Vanguard. In the center of the gorge, Gideon and Cale circled each other. Both Alpha and Rogue were covered in deep, savage wounds, their breathing ragged and heavy. Kyle lunged, his jaws aiming for Gideon's throat. But Gideon was not just a beast. He possessed the tactical discipline Beatrice had reinforced in him. Instead of meeting the charge, Gideon dropped his weight, sliding beneath Cale's massive claws, and drove his fist upward, embedding a silver-hilted dagger, a gift from Beatrice, directly into Cale's ribs. Kyle let out a gurgling howl, his body convulsing before he collapsed into the snow, the rogue rebellion dying with its leader. Gideon stood slowly, pulling the dagger free. He shifted back into his human form, ignoring the freezing cold despite his torn clothing and bleeding wounds. His golden eyes swept over the battlefield, finally landing on Ramiro Simmons, who was being dragged forward by Commander Godfrey. Beatrice descended the narrow cliff path, her boots hitting the valley floor. The massive lycanthrope warriors and the human knights of the vanguard both parted to let her through, bowing their heads in deep, unprecedented respect. She walked until she stood beside Gideon. The Alpha King reached out, his bloody hand wrapping securely around hers, intertwining their fingers for all to see. Simmons was thrown to his knees in the red snow before them. He looked up at his niece, his face pale and twisted with disbelief. "Beatrice," he stammered, attempting to adopt a tone of familial warmth. You survived. You must stop this beast. I am your blood. I am the governor of Oakhaven." "You are nothing," Beatrice said, her voice echoing with a cold, absolute authority that rivaled Gideon's. "You stole my father's legacy. You poisoned the North, and you attempted to burn your own men alive to save your skin. The Ironwood Concord was broken the moment you sent poisoned wine into Winter Keep." "You cannot kill me," Simmons shrieked, looking at the human knights. "Commander Godfrey, she is bewitched. Will you stand by and let a monster execute a lord of the realm?" Godfrey spat into the snow near Simmons' boots. "My loyalty belongs to the House of Holloway and to the commanders who fight alongside their men, not cowards who hide behind silver fire." Gideon looked down at the pathetic man. "In the North, the penalty for treason and attempted genocide is death." He raised his massive sword, the steel glinting in the pale winter sun. "Wait," Beatrice said softly, resting a hand on Gideon's arm. The Alpha paused instantly, deferring to her. Beatrice looked at Simmons. "Death is too quick for a man who loves power above all else. Commander Godfrey, strip him of his titles. Confiscate the Simmons estates and distribute the wealth to the families of the Vanguard and the lower villages. Let Ramiro live out his days in the deepest, coldest cell of Winter Keep's dungeons, so he can watch the empire he tried to destroy flourish without him. Simmons screamed in protest as the knights dragged him away, his cries fading into the howling wind. With the battle won, a profound stillness settled over the gorge. Commander Godfrey stepped forward, drawing his sword and planting it point down in the snow before Beatrice and Gideon. He dropped to one knee. "The Silver Vanguard pledges its loyalty," Godfrey boomed. "To the Alpha King of the North, and to Beatrice Holloway, the true Queen of Oakhaven." One by one, the knights dropped to their knees. Then the massive lycanthrope warriors of Winterkeep followed suit, bowing their heads to the human woman who had saved their king, cured their sick, and outsmarted their greatest enemy. Gideon turned to Beatrice, a fierce, adoring smile breaking through his exhaustion. He lifted her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles just as he had in the courtyard weeks ago. But this time, there was no impending doom, only a limitless future. "You told me I would not lose my home," Gideon whispered, his amber eyes burning with love. "I told you," Beatrice smiled, reaching up to trace the silver scar on his cheek. "We control the board, and I intend to build a kingdom where neither human nor wolf need hide in the shadows." Years later, the chronicles of Ethelgard would be rewritten. The dark myths of the bloodthirsty beast were replaced by the legend of the Winter Court. Under the joint rule of the Alpha King and his brilliant mortal queen, the North became an impenetrable fortress of prosperity, defended by an integrated army of lycanthropes and human knights. Beatrice Holloway had been sent into the dark as a sacrifice expected to perish in the cold. Instead, she had captured the heart of the beast, tamed the winter, and become the greatest strength the North had ever known. If you love this epic tale of romance, strategy, and unyielding courage, make sure to hit that like button. Do you think Beatrice made the right call, sparing her uncle to rot in the dungeons? Or should the Alpha have finished the job? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to share this video with your fellow fantasy romance fans, and subscribe to the channel for more immersive, thrilling stories brought to life. Ring the notification bell so you never miss an adventure. Until next time, stay brave.